Peggy 16.
Sega. The Napoleonic Age, a time of epic land battles and naval engagements, of political unrest and widespread revolution, an era defined by one legendary general.
Hi, I'm Kieran Bridge, Studio Communications Manager for the Creative Assembly. Today we're going to show you a 2-on-2 multiplayer battle in Napoleon Total War. The battlefield we're fighting over will be Waterloo, one of the historical scenarios available in Napoleon, and a battle map for multiplayer play. I'll be playing as the British, led by the valiant General Picton, whose top hat is the source of his power. My allies in this venture will be the Prussians, also a capable and standard force, very well drilled with very good elite infantry units. We'll be seeking to dominate and take the valuable middle ground of Waterloo against an opposition of a combined Spanish and French force. The early rush for the middle ground begins, with me committing as many of my troops as possible and the Prussians doing the same in order to take as much ground as we can from our enemies so as not to be forced back toward our defensive positions. The Spanish also move forward with speed. An army composed of heavy cavalry units is coming up on their flank, a deadly and quick force on the battlefield. I try and counter this by bringing my artillery very quickly into position. Horse-drawn artillery is absolutely key to position and movement on the battlefield. Setting this up early allows me to pound the French lines before they ever get into position, giving them devastating morale penalties and casualties before they arrive. Early French skirmishers now move forward, backed by French line infantry. I move my own skirmishers forward, matching the French for range and reload, hoping that the better of the two sets of men will win the day. Skirmishers begin to engage one another now in early combat, picking targets and firing at will. I back these up with a line of British infantry. The sheer power of the Redcoats cannot be undone as I pour fire onto the French advance force. I also send in a unit of cavalry to try and quickly rout the French advance. I'm forced to turn these back, however, when I realise that the French advance force has deployed stakes, a mobile defence system that allows them to drive off early cavalry attacks. Clearly it will have to be strength of arms that wins this early engagement, and I order my troops to pour fire on my French opposition. Quickly, the French try and counter with a horse charge, throwing all of their cavalry against my own men. However, I formed a square, forcing their horses to balk and rear up, throwing the riders. Their charge will now be largely ineffective against my flanks, as my troops fight them off in a very good defensive position. The French are forced to retreat, their early manoeuvres now in disarray. It's important now to seize the imperative and push forward on the battlefield, disrupting the French advance once and for all. They counter with grenadiers, throwing explosives into the British square, dealing massive casualties and morale damage to my flank. On the other side of the map, the Spanish and Prussians have now lined up against one another. Long lines of infantry rake fire into each other as they try and dominate the central position. This is a sheer test of firepower and will between the two armies. Massive bursts of gunfire go off as the Spanish seek to find an advantage over the Prussians. They see a weakness and seize it. Pouring in the heavy cavalry units that we saw earlier in the game, they seek to smash the Prussian right flank and devolve the Prussian advance before it can even begin. The Prussian flank is helpless to resist such a heavy cavalry charge and begins to fold almost instantly. The Prussian-British advance is now in real danger. If the Prussian flank folds, we'll have a unit of heavy cavalry from the Spanish between us both. In a desperate bid to stop this problem, the Prussians commit all of their cavalry in a final last-ditch effort to hold the Spanish cavalry in place. We can only hope that the Prussians can at least hold or win the day here against the advancing Spanish. With these actions now ongoing, I push an advance force of British straight into the gap that has now formed between the Spanish and French lines, hoping to exploit the disarray that has become the French initial action. The chaos of the front line quickly yields me the opportunity to move my artillery forward and begin to pound the exposed Spanish flank. Our Spanish opposition is now in real trouble. He's pinned from the front with the might of the Prussian army and taking fire with power from the right. British artillery begins pouring grape shot into the Spanish line as the Prussians hold him in play at the front. The French are busy trying to deal with my early actions, and the Spanish now have the force of 2 of their opponents bearing down upon them. The Spanish are now forced to divert troops to deal with this emerging threat from the British and weaken the firepower they can yield against the Prussians. Truly, their army is now about to be divided and conquered. British artillery units hidden behind cover will now fire into the Spanish position. Heavy shells exploding overhead, breaking the Spanish morale and causing them to take massive casualties. The Spanish player is now all but finished. His units begin to rout as they panic and flee the battlefield, explosive shells, canister shot and rifle fire pouring into their ranks. The French are now forced into abandoning their early positions as they can only watch their ally crumble and defeat. A charge from the Royal Scots Greys finally finishes the rear of the Spanish units. The Spanish utterly broken, we now turn our attention on France. The initial French position amongst the trees will have to be abandoned as I push forward a unit of Highland foot. These units are incredibly adept at close combat and are devastating in melee. When they commit to the French, I can only hope that by sheer force of arms and combat prowess, I can win the day. Grenades, explosions and hand-to-hand combat rip through the French line as they begin to falter and have to begin to retreat backward. The Royal Scots Greys, an elite unit of British cavalry, are now free to ride to the crest of the hill where the remaining French artillery piece is located. With a single charge, I hope to destroy their only artillery option, forcing them to use the remains of their infantry against me. My Prussian ally mop up the remains of the Spanish army and begin to turn on the remains of the French, knowing now that we've all but succeeded, barring some horrible tactical blunder. My own troops have now taken up position where the French used to occupy the battlefield and are firing into the French line as it retreats towards a final bastion of defence. The French have garrisoned this stronghold right near the position in which they started. They fire safely from the windows, causing massive casualties to my troops and taking few damage in return. I need to find some way to liberate this position and finally push on to the final hill and crush the remains of the French army. Using the trees as cover, I begin to try and formulate some form of strategy to actually destroy the French where they stand and hopefully win the battle with a final decisive move. This opportunity comes when I retarget my howitzer cannons on the building the French have occupied. With the Spanish line shattered, I'm free to use these explosives on the garrison building. The French now know that the building is all but lost. Should it collapse on above them, all of the units inside will be killed. They run literally for the hills. The final French units involved in this battle will be the elite French Old Guard. They truly will stand to the last. It's now up to me to rout and destroy the French Old Guard on this hilltop. I send a unit of line infantry to crest the hill, explosives bursting behind their back, Union Jacks waving ahead of them as they crest this final precipice and crash into the French units. It's all over for France. They must know this is it, but they fight bravely on before surrendering and retreating from the battlefield. For Prussia and Britain, a glorious victory. For France and Spain, a hideous, shaming, personally damning defeat. Thank you very, very much for watching. This has been Napoleon Total War.